Before we start, just a small favor, put your phone down for a moment. Because what you're about to hear doesn't belong to the age of notifications. It belongs to an older rhythm, one carved into stone, hidden under centuries of dust, and still quietly keeping time. A few years ago, under Jerusalem's old wall, archaeologists found a chamber sealed so tightly that even air hadn't entered since the Crusades. Inside was a single bronze gear, perfectly round, engraved not with numbers, but with Hebrew letters. It didn't match any clock ever made. In fact, it seemed to count something else entirely. The scholars who studied it noticed something strange. The ratios on the gear, its spacing, its teeth, its symmetry, were identical to the proportions used in Solomon's temple, and again in Gothic cathedrals, and again in modern atomic clocks. How could one pattern echo across 3,000 years of builders, men who never met, never shared a language, yet carved the same invisible rhythm into stone, glass, and metal? Some called it coincidence. Others whispered it was design. But among the old guilds of masons and monks, there's another name for it, a name that never made it into textbooks. They called it the Clock of Solomon. So tonight, we're going to follow that pattern, from a sealed vault beneath the Holy City, through cathedrals that still hum with forgotten geometry, to laboratories where physicists hear time sing. And maybe, just maybe, you'll start to wonder if the hours we live inside were built by men, or only borrowed from something divine. So find a quiet place, let the noise fade, close your eyes, and listen. Because the oldest clock in the world is about to start ticking again. If you've ever stood near an excavation site, you'll know the quiet isn't really silence. It's a kind of listening, the earth listening back. Beneath the old stones of Jerusalem, they say the ground still remembers hands. It remembers tools, sweat, prayers, and secrets that were never meant to be unearthed. In the 2021 cruise, when a team of archaeologists started digging below the southern wall of the Temple Mount, they didn't expect to find much. Maybe a few pottery shards or discarded coins. What they found instead was a sealed basalt chamber, dark as a heartbeat and untouched for centuries. The first thing that met them was not gold or writing or art. It was the air itself, cool, stale, heavy with the scent of copper and old dust. The kind of air that feels thicker than time. When the light from their lamps brushed the stone floor, something flickered back. A small piece of bronze, no larger than a coin, half swallowed by sand. One of them brushed it gently, and the sand gave way like it was finally exhaling. Underneath lay a fragment of a gear. It didn't look like much. A few teeth fused by heat, edges dulled. But the ring inside it was carved with symbols older than the Hebrew most of us recognize today. Not words exactly, but shapes. Paleo-Hebrew numerals, etched with a steady hand that must have believed precision was a form of prayer. Around the edge were 24 divisions, perfectly even. At first, the team thought it was some kind of astrolabe, a device for charting stars. But the pattern didn't fit any known astronomical cycle. It wasn't lunar, it wasn't solar. One researcher realized it matched something else entirely, the priestly schedule described in the Book of Kings. In simpler words, it wasn't a calendar for the sky. It was a timetable for devotion, a rhythm of offerings and songs, the heartbeat of an ancient temple. Imagine that. A gear that doesn't count time, but faith. The archaeologists didn't say that out loud, of course. They kept their language technical, measurements, soil layers, patina samples, but among them, quiet looks passed back and forth. the kind you see when people sense they've touched something that isn't supposed to move. The chamber itself was small, almost womb-like, carved straight into basalt. Its walls were lined with rough stones, but here and there, a few had been fitted so precisely that you could hardly slide a blade of light between them. That kind of precision doesn't happen by accident. It's the mark of a builder who was measuring against something more than sight, maybe sound, maybe breath. Later, when they analyzed the stone, they noticed something uncanny. The proportions of those fitted blocks matched the same ratios found in Herod's retaining wall above. The same spacing, the same height-to-width rhythm. Different eras, different builders, same underlying geometry. As if every generation had been tracing a line it didn't fully understand but couldn't stop following. I always find that idea haunting, that a design can survive long after its purpose is forgotten, like a melody stuck in the bones of a civilization. Back in the lab, when they cleaned the bronze fragment, the metal shimmered faintly under lamplight, revealing delicate etch marks between the teeth, too fine for tools of that period. One researcher joked that the craftsman must have had a steadier hand than most surgeons. Another replied softly, or more faith. They didn't publish that part. It stayed in the field notes, in the margins where curiosity hides. But what fascinated them most wasn't the gear. It was the memory built into it. When they compared its dimensions to architectural blueprints from different centuries, they found echoes. The same spacing in cathedral windows, the same arc ratios in Gothic vaults, even the same curve in some Renaissance clocks. The pattern was migrating, east to west, like a language being whispered through stone. It's strange to think about, isn't it? That a shape can travel across empires, changing materials but never meaning. Bronze becomes limestone. Limestone becomes glass. Glass becomes a drawing on vellum. And still, the ratio breathes. The dig team eventually sealed the chamber again, at least temporarily. Officially for preservation. Unofficially, perhaps because standing down there too long made people uneasy. They said it was the acoustics, the way every sound seemed to echo twice, once forward and once backward. But if you've ever been in a truly ancient place, you know the feeling. It's not fear, it's awareness. The sense that you've stepped into something that's still ticking, even when no one's watching. Before they left, one of the archaeologists ran her palm across the wall and said it felt warm. Not heat warm, more like breath warm. The others laughed it off. Jerusalem does that sometimes, holding the day's heat in its stones. But she said, no, it wasn't that. It felt like something remembering. When they climbed back into daylight, the noise of the city felt almost too loud. Traffic, market vendors, the everyday pulse of the living world. It all seemed faster, harsher, as if the earth below was keeping time to a slower song. And maybe that's what the Clock of Solomon really was. Not a device, but a reminder that time itself isn't something we invented. It's something we entered. The archaeologists filed their reports, labeled their photos, boxed their samples, and moved on to other sites. But a few months later, one of them, an older researcher who'd handled the gear most, sent a quiet note to a colleague in Europe. The message was short. Ratios identical to Chartres. The measure survives. And that's where the trail truly begins. Because from the dust beneath Jerusalem, the pattern would start moving again, traveling west, carried by builders who no longer remembered what they were building for. When the bronze gear finally reached the conservation lab, it was smaller than anyone remembered, barely the size of a palm, but somehow heavier than it looked. Bronze does that. It carries density the way old books carry silence. They placed it under the microscope, measured its corrosion, and checked for tool marks. The report came back neat, clinical, certain. Manufactured roughly 700 years after the First Temple period. In other words, it wasn't ancient enough to be Solomon's. It was a memory, not an artifact. But memories are stubborn things. They cling to matter the way scent clings to old paper. When the technicians rinsed the dirt from one edge, a thin roll of parchment appeared, so fragile that the air alone seemed to bruise it. A single line of text ran across it, written in two scripts, Latin and Hebrew, as if the writer couldn't decide which tongue belonged to faith. It read, Mensura Salomonis custodita est. The measure of Solomon is kept, not found, not lost, kept, like a vow, still waiting to be honored. That small phrase pulled historians into a quiet debate. Some said it was a medieval forgery, probably made by monks who loved puzzles. Others believed it came from a much stranger lineage, a group of builders who had learned their geometry in the East during the Crusades. If you trace the routes of those builders, something interesting happens. You begin to see the same ratios appearing again and again, on cathedral blueprints in France, on water clock drawings in Damascus, even in the floor plans of monasteries in Portugal. The pattern had migrated, faithful and invisible. One historian, an old friend of mine, the kind who speaks in half-jokes, once said, "Medieval engineers carried geometry the way monks carried relics." And I think he was right. Because when you look at the masons' marks hidden inside those cathedrals, you see repetition with devotion. They weren't just building for symmetry. They were tuning space to a rhythm that came from far older stones. It's hard not to imagine a Crusader craftsman standing in the half-light of a European workshop, drawing the same spiral his teacher once drew under a Middle Eastern sun. Maybe he didn't even know what it meant anymore, only that it felt right. That's how memory hides in craft. Not in words, but in the way the hand moves when it believes it's doing something sacred. For a while, that phrase, "the measure of Solomon is kept," became an inside reference among the historians. You'd hear it whispered at conferences when someone showed an impossible connection between two architectural sites. A vault in England that matched a minaret in Syria, a cloister arch with the same angle as a temple gate. Coincidence, perhaps. But too many coincidences start to sound like design. One paper even argued that measure didn't originally mean length at all. It meant rhythm. The Hebrew word for measure, midah, shares a root with manner and pattern. It can mean the way something moves, not just how big it is. In that light, Solomon's temple wasn't just an address. It was a metronome for worship, a sacred rhythm the world could step in and out of. When you think about it, that's not so different from a clock, is it? A device that turns devotion into movement and movement into meaning. What fascinates me most, though, is how the idea refused to die. Every few centuries, the measure of Solomon shows up again. Sometimes in the margins of cathedral drawings, sometimes in secret guild notes. The builders always claim they're not inventing anything new. They say they're continuing the measure. It's a strange phrase, modest but proud, like a craftsman saying, "I didn't start the song, I just keep it in tune." Somewhere in that Jerusalem chamber, they must have felt the same humility. Because if the artifact wasn't ancient, it meant someone later had remembered the old ratios and chosen to preserve them, not to impress anyone, but to keep something alive. That's what faith often looks like when history forgets it. Not temples or miracles, but maintenance. Quiet, careful, tireless maintenance. And that small bronze gear with its 24 divisions and its silent teeth became more than evidence. It became a bridge, a link between devotion in stone and devotion in mechanism. When the report was sent to Europe, it included one image: the gear, photographed under lamplight, its shadow forming a perfect circle on the table. Below it, the curator wrote a single line: "Continuity confirmed in ratio, not relic." He had no idea that those words would soon reach an architect in France, buried deep in the archives of Chartres Cathedral, an architect who would recognize the same pattern carved above a rose window built 800 years earlier. That's how the story moves now, not through empires or armies, but through measurements that refuse to forget their source. And so the pattern, once sealed beneath the wall, began its journey westward, across the Mediterranean, carried in drawings, carried in memory, carried by the hands of men who believed that precision was a form of prayer. If you've ever visited an old cathedral, you'll know the strange feeling that settles in your chest the moment you step inside. It's not awe exactly, it's alignment. Something about the proportions feels right. You stand there, neck tilted back, tracing the ribs of stone that meet in the high vault. And even if you can't name it, your body knows. You're standing inside a pattern. That feeling didn't start in Europe. It started in Jerusalem. The phrase, "the measure of Solomon," isn't poetry. It was a real system. In the ancient texts, Solomon's temple wasn't just a holy building. It was a kind of calendar made solid. Every beam, every pillar, every cubit had a rhythm to it. The priests didn't just walk through corridors. They moved through time. Now, when we say cubit, it sounds academic, but in truth, it was one of the most human units ever used. A cubit was simply the length from your elbow to your fingertips, with a span of the hand added in certain cases. A sacred cubit, the one used in temples, was slightly longer, said to include not just the hand, but the space of intention between fingers. That's theology turned into ergonomics, a temple measured to the body of the person who built it. Modern scholars used to think those numbers, lengths, widths, altars, were arbitrary or symbolic. But when you overlay them on later sacred sites, something incredible happens. The ratios hold. The relationship between height and width, the arc of the entrance, even the spacing of columns. It all echoes a simple geometry. 1 to root 2. 1 to the golden ratio, 1 to the proportions of a standing human. Imagine the same invisible song being hummed by builders thousands of years apart. The temple becomes Chartres. Chartres becomes Florence. Florence becomes every quiet church tower that measures not the hours of day, but the heartbeat of prayer. A few decades ago, a Hebrew scholar named Ezra Mayor proposed something quietly revolutionary. He said that in older Hebrew, the word for measure, midah, also meant manner or rhythm. So when the old record said the measure of the altar, they might have meant the rhythm of its use. In other words, Solomon's measure wasn't about size at all. It was about timing. Picture it, the temple not as an architectural space, but as a metronome for faith, a great clock made of light and stone, ticking to the rhythm of human devotion. When the archaeologists compared the ratios from the bronze gear to these temple dimensions, they found an exact match in spacing. Not approximate, exact. It was as if someone had tried to shrink the temple's rhythm into a mechanism, not a miniature of the building, but a portable version of its heartbeat. One might laugh at that thought, a clock that prays. But when you look closely at the history of sacred architecture, you realize humanity has always tried to turn reverence into rhythm. Bells toll, candles burn to measure vigils, sand trickles through glass to mark silence. The act of worship has always been an act of timekeeping. In those early centuries, builders didn't separate engineering from belief. To carve a perfect arch was to honor the same order they saw in creation. A misplaced stone wasn't just a mistake. It was a theological error. And that's where the measure of Solomon truly lives, in the space between mathematics and meaning. It's easy to imagine the old masons whispering it to each other like a password, a quiet promise that their hands were still following divine geometry, even when no priest watched. It's beautiful, isn't it? That even after empires fell and languages fractured, a ratio, something so small, so pure, kept moving, unnoticed, faithful to its purpose. By the 12th century, that ratio had migrated into Europe. It shows up in the layouts of cathedrals, in the rose windows of France, in the spiral columns of Spain. And though every guild gave it a new name, they all meant the same thing: the balance that honors the Creator. The story of that balance is where our trail leads next, because somewhere in the archives of Chartres Cathedral, a margin note will appear that connects this ancient measure to the craftsman who built in stone the way others wrote psalms. And it is in those quiet sketches, drawn by candlelight on scraps of vellum, that we'll find the next clue: the code of the builders themselves. When people talk about the great cathedrals of Europe, they usually talk about the miracles of art: the glass, the towers, the light that feels almost alive. But if you step into one of those places early in the morning, before the tourists come and the choir warms up, you'll hear something else. A quiet clicking, not metal or clockwork, just the sound of the building adjusting to the day. Stone expands in the cold, wood settles, and the whole place seems to breathe. That's the language the builders spoke. Hidden behind all the saints and stained glass was an obsession with proportion, the measure passed down from the old world. And in their own way, the medieval masons became its keepers. In the margin of an old parchment from Chartres Cathedral, nothing fancy, just a sketch of an arch and a note written sideways, a single ratio appears. 1, 2. Next to it, in smaller letters, someone wrote in Latin, mensura custodita. The measure is kept. The same phrase from the parchment in Jerusalem. Hundreds of miles apart, centuries apart, and yet the same vow. It wasn't just a technical note. It was a kind of prayer written in geometry. Every curve of those cathedrals followed a rhythm, and that rhythm wasn't random. The great arches and vaults matched the same intervals found in the Psalms, in the spacing of the Hebrew prayers. It's as if the builders weren't constructing walls, but tuning instruments. When the sun passed through the colored glass at certain hours, the light would hit specific points, like the notes of a chord. And when the choir began to sing, the resonance of the vault amplified those same harmonics: light, sound, and space, all keeping time with one another. The scholars who later studied these cathedrals tried to explain it as coincidence, but anyone who's ever built something by hand knows the difference between chance and intention. These men didn't just calculate, they listened. They believed that the world itself had a rhythm laid into it by its maker. Their job wasn't to create it, it was to hear it and build in tune. That's where the term Guild of the Compass first appears. Not a secret society in the dramatic sense, no cloaks or hidden rituals, just a lineage of craftsmen who believed their geometry had a moral duty. Their compass was more than a tool. It was a reminder that every perfect circle had only one center. And for them, that center was divine order. The guild taught its apprentices to memorize proportions, not by numbers, but by muscle and breath. One story tells of an old master who trained his students by tapping their shoulders while they carved. If they lost rhythm, if their chisel stroke fell out of time, he'd hum softly until they found it again. The lesson was simple. Good geometry has a pulse. When you think about it that way, cathedrals aren't frozen architecture at all. They're slow-moving pendulums. Every sunrise resets their alignment. Every shadow shift marks the turning of invisible gears. And at the heart of it all, those builders carried something older than blueprints. A sense of continuity that stretched back to the stones beneath Jerusalem. They might not have known the full story of the measure of Solomon, but they lived it in every line they drew. There's a quiet kind of humility in that. These men worked their entire lives on projects they'd never see finished, carving blocks for towers that would rise long after they were gone. Yet they believed each cut mattered, that precision itself was devotion. When the stones stopped moving, one historian wrote, Europe began to keep its hours inside them. It's a poetic way to say that architecture became the continent's clock. Every arch, every bell, every reflection of sunlight through stained glass, all of it beating time in the memory of a pattern that had crossed continents. And as the medieval world expanded, that pattern didn't fade. It traveled. Through crusaders and traders, through scholars and spies, through the thin lines of maps that connected east and west. Because while Europe was building towers to reach heaven, another civilization was busy perfecting time itself, crafting instruments that didn't just echo the sky, but measured it with breathtaking precision. And that is where our story turns next, to a land where geometry met motion and prayer found a clockmaker's hand. There's an old saying among stonemasons, every wall remembers its hand. You can see it when light grazes the surface at sunset. The tiny imperfections, the uneven rhythm of hammer marks, each belonging to a different person, a different century. But sometimes, patterns repeat so perfectly that the stones seem to recognize one another. That's what researchers noticed when they began comparing mason marks across Jerusalem, Sicily, and Chartres. It started as a curiosity. Small geometric carvings hidden on the undersides of blocks, never meant for public view. Triangles, spirals, interlocked circles, signatures, yes, but more than that, a language. When the marks were catalogued and compared, something odd appeared. The same sequence of shapes showed up thousands of kilometers apart, carved by different guilds in different centuries. One researcher overlaid the diagrams and found that they matched at precise ratios identical to the measure of Solomon. It was as if the masons were leaving behind a breadcrumb trail, one block at a time, for whoever cared to notice. Not a secret code, but a rhythm etched into the skin of history. Some skeptics said the similarity was just trade influence. Stonemasons traveled, shared techniques, learned from each other. True. But that doesn't explain the precision. These weren't rough approximations. They were mirrored down to the fraction. To understand why that matters, imagine carving a pattern by hand with a hammer and chisel. One extra tap, one tremor of your wrist, and the whole angle changes. Now imagine that same angle, identical, appearing in a distant cathedral centuries later. That's not accident. That's memory, transmitted through craft. In the records of a 13th century workshop in southern France, there's a note scrawled at the edge of a ledger. From the brothers of the compass in the east, the triangle is kept. It's the first direct mention of what later writers would call the Guild of the Compass, an informal network of master builders who claimed their geometry came from the first measure. No one ever found a charter or official membership list. Their existence survives in repetition. Their cathedrals always carry the same signature, a balance of three: height, width, and the invisible line connecting heaven and earth. The Triangle of Solomon, they called it. Not a symbol of divinity, but of proportion, faith expressed in mathematics. If you listen closely, you can almost hear how it must have sounded inside those workshops. The steady tap of metal against stone, the scrape of sand against skin, the murmur of Latin prayers under breath. No one shouting, no grand speeches, just rhythm. Every sound a tick in an invisible clock that spanned generations. And that's the beauty of it. Their faith wasn't loud, it was measured. They didn't need to talk about belief. They built it into walls. When I walked through Chartres years ago, a local guide pointed to a small symbol hidden near the apse, a circle inside a square, drawn so faintly you'd miss it if you blinked. He said, "They left these for each other, not for us." That line stuck with me. It reminded me how history is less about discovery and more about overhearing a conversation that was never meant to end. It's comforting in a way. Even as kingdoms rose and fell, the rhythm of the chisel didn't change. Each blow carried something from the old world forward: geometry, patience, reverence. You can think of it as arithmetic carved in stone. One ratio multiplied by faith, divided by time. A formula with no written record, just the echo of tools in the dark. And when the last stone was laid and the scaffolds taken down, the building itself became the ledger. The geometry didn't die. It fossilized in architecture. The measure of Solomon turned into music frozen in limestone. But the story doesn't stop with cathedrals, because while these Western builders were preserving the pattern in silence and shadow, another world was doing something else entirely. In the golden cities of Al-Andalus, scholars were putting the same geometry into motion. Where Europe built stillness, the Islamic world built movement. Light, water, and stars all flowing to the same invisible beat. And that's where the next piece of this long clock begins to turn. Every cathedral is built on silence. Not the kind you find in empty rooms, but a thicker silence, the kind that feels alive, pulsing just beneath the surface. If you've ever stood in the nave of one and whispered a word, you know what happens. Your voice doesn't just echo. It drifts upward, unfolds, and lingers. It's as if the air itself has been trained to hold memory. The medieval builders called this living geometry. To them, a church wasn't static. It was breathing. They believed that light and sound could move like water if you gave them the right shape. So they built arches that acted like lungs, columns that carried whispers, and windows that filtered sunlight into steady, rhythmic intervals. Every beam of color from stained glass fell in the same measured order each day, like seconds through an invisible hourglass. And it wasn't just beauty, it was timing. The masons of the Guild of the Compass taught that light itself was divine rhythm made visible. When dawn passed through those tall rose windows, it wasn't decoration, it was instruction, a lesson in precision and patience. You can still feel it if you sit quietly in those cathedrals when the morning sun hits the east transept. It's not bright, it's soft, measured, exact. The same pattern of light that touched the stones 800 years ago still returns, on the same day, at the same angle. No clock, no calculation, just devotion and geometry keeping time together. A French historian once described cathedrals as frozen pendulums. I like that. It's simple and true. Each tower is a counterweight, each arch a swing of faith captured in mid-motion. And when you think about it, that's what makes these buildings so alive. They move, even when they stand still. Builders in that era saw no line between science and faith. If a ratio was perfect, it was holy. If light passed through a window just so, it was a small miracle of math. They didn't separate the two. They believed precision itself was prayer. That's why cathedrals feel so strangely human. They're not machines, not monuments. They're collaborations between mind and material. Each stone, each color, each note sung inside them adds to one long, patient rhythm, the rhythm of attention. And attention, to those builders, was everything. Lose attention, and the wall cracks. Keep attention, and the building lives longer than empires. You can almost imagine them, those craftsmen in wool tunics, lifting blocks with pulleys, squinting into sunlight, arguing gently over a single millimeter. And when the day's work was done, perhaps one would rest a hand on the stone and say nothing, just listen for the pulse of what they'd made. Over centuries, that same pulse spread outward, carried by trade routes and pilgrimage roads, reaching new cities, new builders, new faiths. The measure of Solomon was no longer tied to one temple or one religion. It had become a universal rhythm, moving quietly through culture itself. Eventually, those same lines and ratios began to appear far from Europe, in the intricate water clocks and celestial devices of the Islamic world. Where the Western masons froze rhythm into stone, Muslim engineers turned it back into motion. It's a beautiful symmetry, really. Two worlds tracing the same geometry, one in stillness, one in flow. One making architecture that breathes, the other creating machines that sing. And it's at that meeting point, where the guild's compass meets the scholar's astrolabe, that our story continues. Because in the deserts of Al-Andalus and the courts of Cordoba, a new kind of builder was born. One who measured faith not in arches, but in hours. If Europe carved its faith into stone, the Islamic world wrote it in light. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Cordoba was a city where ideas glowed brighter than gold. Libraries instead of fortresses, scholars instead of kings. Every evening, the call to prayer drifted over tiled roofs like music made of numbers, dividing the day not by hours, but by rhythm. And in that rhythm lay a kind of perfection. 5 times a day, across thousands of cities, millions of people would pause at once, all facing the same direction, all marking the same moment. If you think about it, that's the most synchronized act of timekeeping in human history. The masons of Europe might have built towers to measure light, but here, light and time were measured through faith itself. That's where the astrolabe comes in. Now, if you've never seen one, imagine a brass disc covered in engravings that look halfway between a clock face and a map of the stars. It wasn't built to tell time like a wristwatch. It was made to understand time, to feel its movement through the heavens. Every star had its coordinate, every city its latitude, every day its own slow turning. And with a steady hand, an astronomer or a scholar could trace that motion with a pointer called an alidade, a thin arm that moved across the face of the device, aligning heaven with earth. That simple act, turning a pointer to meet a star, was a prayer in itself. What fascinates me is that the same ratios from the temple and the cathedrals appeared again on these instruments. Their geometry wasn't random, it was inherited. The same divisions, the same harmonics, the same love of balance. Even the language carried echoes. The Hebrew word zuman means time or season. The Arabic Zaman means the same. Two languages, two faiths, tracing the same circle. In Cordoba, the great scholar al-Zarqal built an astrolabe so precise that European astronomers later called it the instrument of the wise. He described it not as a tool, but as a mirror of motion. That phrase stayed with me, because that's exactly what all of these artifacts are, from the bronze gear under Jerusalem to the rose windows of France. Mirrors of motion. What's extraordinary is how seamlessly faith and physics work together. No one saw contradiction. The motion of stars was not something to fear, it was something to praise. The cosmos itself was proof that the universe had rhythm, and if you learned to read that rhythm, you were in a way reading the handwriting of creation. It's humbling when you think about it. These scholars sat beneath desert skies, drawing circles on parchment, building instruments of bronze and wood, never to boast, but to harmonize their own lives with something immeasurable. Their work turned the night sky into a temple dome. Each star became a note in an endless song. And when travelers from the West arrived, pilgrims, soldiers, masons, they found more than a new city. They found a new understanding of time. A time that wasn't kept by bells or kings, but by the rising and setting of something eternal. Some of those travelers returned home changed. They brought back fragments, small sketches of devices, ideas half-remembered, ratios copied into notebooks. And from those fragments, the Guild of the Compass would one day design their own interpretation, a merging of stone and star, a clock that didn't just imitate heaven, but tried to join it. But before that could happen, something even more curious took place. The geometry of the East and the craft of the West began to overlap, creating a single rhythm neither world could fully claim as its own. A shared symmetry, a faith in proportion that crossed every border drawn by men, and that shared rhythm, steady as breath, patient as light, would soon find a home in the hands of one man who tried to turn it into sound. He lived not in Cordoba, but in a cold European city that loved invention almost as much as it loved secrecy. His name was Johann Kelsner, and he would spend the rest of his life trying to build what he called the clock of God's breath. The more you study the medieval world, the more you realize that history wasn't divided by belief. It was stitched together by geometry. When crusaders returned from the East, they didn't only bring relics or stories. They brought ratios. Some carried sketches of water clocks. Others copied tables of star positions. And a few, quietly, returned with the designs of al-Jazari, the Muslim engineer whose imagination still humbles modern science. Al-Jazari's water clocks were not just clever machines. They were sermons built in bronze. One model was shaped like a palace. Fountains flowed, stars rotated, tiny doors opened to reveal angels marking the hours. Every motion followed a rhythm, not of seconds, but of prayer. It wasn't designed to measure time. It was designed to celebrate it. And when European builders saw those designs, something clicked. They recognized their own obsession. Balance, symmetry, motion. They just hadn't realized faith could be measured so beautifully. So the dialogue began, quietly, unofficially, between scholars and craftsmen. One side taught how water could carry rhythm. The other showed how stone could preserve it. And from that unspoken conversation, the first truly universal geometry was born. You can trace it in architecture. Look at the domes of Cordoba, the vaults of Chartres, the mosaics of Damascus. They all share one heartbeat, the same spiral that grows from a center and never stops. It's called a geometric progression in modern math, but in sacred architecture, it was known by another name, the breath of God. What's fascinating is that neither side claimed ownership. A craftsman in France might carve a pattern learned from a Syrian mason without even knowing it. An astronomer in Baghdad might polish a brass plate cut in Venice. Ideas traveled faster than armies. Somewhere along those routes, the measure of Solomon stopped belonging to one story. It became everyone's. And here's a small, almost humorous twist in the tale. European builders tried to imitate the precision of Islamic astrolabes, but had no idea how the math worked. So they invented new machines to fake it. That's how early mechanical clocks were born. Not from commerce or kings, but from envy of an elegance they couldn't quite understand. Of course, imitation is still admiration. The cross-pollination between cultures made something new, a language that both faiths could read. A cathedral tower in France began to chime on the same intervals as a muezzin's call in Cairo. Different notes, same measure. It's almost poetic, isn't it? The two civilizations most often painted as rivals were, in truth, collaborating, silently, through the steady tick of geometry. By the late 1500s, those blended patterns found their way to the heart of Europe, to a city that collected ideas the way others collected gold. A place where mystics, mathematicians, and dreamers lived side by side under candlelight. That city was Prague, and at its center stood an emperor who believed that science was the highest form of prayer. Under his patronage, a strange young engineer began his work, studying fragments of Arabic astrolabes and cathedral blueprints, convinced that if he could merge them, he could rebuild what Solomon once kept. A clock not bound to hours, but to harmony. He called it the clock of God's breath, and his name, though history barely remembers it, was Johann Kelzner. Prague, around the year 1590, was the kind of city that didn't sleep so much as dream with its eyes open. Alchemy, astronomy, and theology shared the same streets, and every basement smelled faintly of ink, candle wax, and heated metal. Under the reign of Emperor Rudolf II, curiosity itself had become a kind of currency, an empire not of armies, but of ideas. In one of those narrow streets, in a workshop just below the Hradčany castle, a man named Johann Kelzner worked by the faint light of a single oil lamp. His neighbors thought he made musical instruments. He didn't correct them. What Kelzner actually built were machines of rhythm. He had studied under a clockmaker, yes, but his notes were filled not with numbers, but with psalms, margins full of Hebrew letters, astrological signs, and fragments of geometry copied from cathedral drawings. If someone had looked closely, they might have realized that what he was building wasn't meant to tell time. It was meant to speak it. Kelzner believed that if Solomon's temple had once kept divine rhythm, then a machine could do the same. He wasn't interested in ticking seconds or hours. He wanted to create a mechanism that would move according to the ancient pattern. 24 divisions, like the priest's daily rotations, tuned to the intervals of sunrise and silence. The story goes that his first attempt failed beautifully. He built a wooden frame, a system of pulleys and pendulums, and when he wound it up for the first time, the clock refused to move. But when the room fell quiet, completely quiet, it began to turn. Only then, as if it required silence to breathe, his apprentices thought it was magic. Kelzner laughed softly and said, "No, not magic, attention. Whether the story is true or not hardly matters. It's the kind of detail history forgets, but myth remembers." And Kelzner, perhaps more than anyone of his age, lived in that blur between the two. Rudolf II heard about the experiment through the court astrologer. Within weeks, Kelzner was summoned to the palace. The emperor was known to collect strange things, rare minerals, mechanical birds, paintings of angels drawn with compass marks. When he saw Kelzner's device, he didn't ask how it worked. He asked what it measured. Kelzner's answer survives in a single line, written in his shaky Latin, Temporum spiritus, the breath of time. The court scribes thought it was metaphor, but Kelzner meant it literally. He believed that the world itself inhaled and exhaled in cycles, and if one could synchronize with that rhythm, they would glimpse the order of creation. He spent the next decade refining his machine. Brass gears, glass weights, and a dial that glowed faintly when the morning light hit it. It chimed not at regular intervals, but according to celestial conjunctions and equinox alignments. A clock that prayed, in its own way, with the stars. Kelzner wrote in his journals that he was searching for the pulse beneath the hours. When the machine finally worked, or seemed to, its chimes didn't mark minutes. They marked moments of alignment, those rare instants when geometry, light, and attention met in perfect symmetry. People in the palace swore they could feel a change in the air when it sounded, like a deep breath being taken by the building itself. And then, one day it stopped. No one knows why. Some say a Jesuit visitor ordered it dismantled. Others claim it stopped because Kelzner himself died mid-calculation, his heart failing at the exact instant the pendulum did. All we have now are his notes, a sketch of a spiral gear marked with 2 Hebrew letters, Or and Shetika, meaning light and silence. The same words that would one day be found on the broken brass dial recovered from the rubble of a London church 3 centuries later. Kelzner's machine was gone, but the idea had already escaped him. Because once an idea like that exists, it keeps ticking, in other hands, in other ages, waiting for someone to hear it again. When word spread that Kelzner's clock had stopped, most people shrugged. Prague was full of broken miracles. There were cabinets that claimed to turn lead into gold, lenses that promised to show angels, powders that cured death until they didn't. A silent clock was just another failed wonder in a city already crowded with them. But Kelzner wasn't dismissed as a fool. Even his critics admitted he had built something remarkable, even if it refused to behave like a normal machine. The fragments that survived, his notes, sketches, and 1 small brass dial, show a mind balancing on the edge between engineering and prayer. That dial, circular and elegant, bore the Hebrew words Or and Shetika, light and silence. 2 halves of the same idea. He had written a single phrase beneath it in his journal. Time may be kept only where awe remains. To most readers, it sounds poetic. But to Kelzner, it was literal instruction. His clock was designed to move only when the world around it stood still. It was a device that demanded reverence to function, one that refused to measure distracted hours. That's what made it so radical. Every other clock in Europe was built to impose order, to discipline life into predictable ticks. But Kelzner's mechanism asked for the opposite. It asked for quiet. You can imagine how that went over in an empire obsessed with efficiency. Eventually, the Jesuit scholars in Rudolf's court took an interest. They saw Kelzner's work as dangerous, not heretical exactly, but unsettling. A clock that stopped for silence and moved for stillness seemed to blur the boundary between faith and machine. So they inspected his workshop, copied his notes, and, depending on which letter you believe, ordered his device dismantled for the protection of truth. Kelzner didn't resist. He was too tired by then, too thin, his eyes hollowed out from nights spent charting the positions of stars through candle smoke. A friend recorded that, as they removed the clock, he said softly, Perhaps the rhythm was never meant to be caged. He died a few years later, and his notes were scattered, some to the Jesuit archives, some hidden by sympathetic scholars, a few eventually reaching the hands of traveling engineers who didn't even know his name. But his influence didn't vanish. In one letter from a French apprentice to his master, written decades later, there's a sketch of a gear with 24 teeth and the margin note, Kelzner's ratio holds. That apprentice would go on to help design the earliest public clock towers in Europe, the ones that still ring today, not with perfect accuracy, but with uncanny warmth. Maybe that's coincidence, or maybe something of Kelzner's intention. The belief that time should breathe was built into them without anyone realizing. Every clock you hear in an old square, every church bell that drifts over rooftops at dawn, it's hard not to imagine a trace of his design living in those sounds. A rhythm that isn't there to control you, but to remind you that you're part of a larger tempo. Centuries later, one of those traces would turn up again, buried under the rubble of a church bombed during the Second World War. A piece of brass, warped by heat, marked by the same two words Kelzner had engraved on his dial: light and silence. It seems history has a way of keeping its own time. What was broken in Prague would survive the fire in London, carrying its rhythm forward quietly, gear by gear. And that's where our trail leads next, to a city caught between war and faith, where the ticking of clocks mixed with the sound of falling bombs. London, 1940. The city was living inside the sound of its own heartbeat. Sirens, engines, boots, bombs. Every night had its rhythm. 2 hours of tension, 30 minutes of silence, then another barrage. Even time seemed nervous, skipping like a record in the heat. On a narrow street in Clerkenwell stood a small church, built in the late 1800s. Nothing grand, but the kind of place that carried history quietly. Its bell tower was crooked, its pews worn smooth by generations of hands, and its old clock had long since stopped keeping accurate hours. That clock, installed in 1890, had a brass dial engraved with strange symbols no one ever fully understood. Parish records listed it as a continental donation, origin unknown. Most assumed it was just decoration, Victorian whimsy. No one noticed that around the edge of the dial, just beneath the grime of decades, 2 faint inscriptions remained, one in Latin, one in Hebrew, or Shetika. Light. Silence. No one could have guessed it was the last surviving piece of Johann Kelzner's long-lost machine. On the night of December 29th, the Blitz reached Clerkenwell. Fire fell from the sky, and the air itself seemed to vibrate. The church took a direct hit. Roof collapsed, windows shattered, bells came down in a single terrible chord that rolled through the city like thunder. When rescue workers arrived the next morning, there was nothing left but dust, smoke, and the faint smell of burnt metal. But as they sifted through the rubble, one of them heard something impossible. Tick. A single hesitant tick. They cleared the debris and found the old clock face buried under the fallen beams. Its hands had melted, its casing blackened. But deep inside, under layers of ash and soot, one tiny spring was still moving. Just once every few minutes. A pulse, not a rhythm. It wasn't timekeeping, it was remembering. The fragment was taken to a small museum in Bloomsbury for restoration. Under the soot, curators discovered something extraordinary. The gear ratios didn't match any known British design. They matched 16th century Central European prototypes. And on one small, warped cog, they found measurements identical to a pattern known only from Kelzner's lost notes. Even stranger, the spacing of the gear's teeth formed a ratio of 9, 11 to 114, numbers meaningless to most people, but familiar to physicists studying oscillation harmonics. It was the same pattern found in quartz crystal resonance, the foundation of modern timekeeping. A scientist examining the piece later remarked, "It's as if this thing was designed for a frequency that wouldn't exist until centuries later." They never figured out how it survived the heat. Brass melts long before the temperature reached that night. But somehow, this one fragment hadn't. It had burned, yes, but without breaking. When the curator wrote his final report, he included a short note at the bottom of the page. The mechanism is unresponsive to modern repair. Movement returns briefly under vibration, ceasing only when the environment grows silent. It was Kelzner's principle all over again, his machine that breathed only when stillness returned. That small discovery didn't make the headlines, of course. The world had other things to worry about. But in the archives of that little museum, one photograph remains. A melted brass disc resting on a sheet of linen, its surface faintly gleaming. The Hebrew letters almost invisible unless you know where to look. Light. Silence. The rhythm persisted, patient as always, and soon that rhythm would catch the attention of another kind of observer, one not driven by faith or art, but by the new gospel of precision. Because a few years later, in a cold laboratory in Switzerland, a group of scientists working with atomic oscillations would find something eerily familiar in their equations. The same ratios, the same pattern of breath and pause, the same measure once carved in stone and sung in cathedrals, now flickering inside machines of glass and metal. It seemed that Solomon's rhythm had not stopped. It had simply changed instruments. The restoration lab at the museum was small, quiet, and smelled faintly of machine oil and damp paper. It was the kind of place where history went to be repaired one breath at a time. A curator named Dr. Amelia Rowe was assigned to catalog the items from the destroyed Clerkenwell Church. To her, it was just another salvage job. Organ pipes, broken stained glass, fragments of the bell tower. But when she unwrapped the melted brass dial, she stopped. Even half-warped, it had grace. The etchings were shallow but deliberate, and the teeth of the largest gear were worn smooth, as if it had been handled with care for centuries. Under the lamp, faint letters appeared where soot had clung to the grooves. She didn't know Hebrew, but she recognized one of the Latin words on the inner ring: lux, light. Something about it made her hesitate before she touched it again. She wrote in her notes later, "It seemed to hum when the room went still." At first, she thought it was imagination, the way silence can play tricks on tired ears. But a vibration meter set beside the artifact confirmed it. Every few minutes, when the room was completely quiet, the device emitted a soft, measurable pulse. Not sound exactly, more like the echo of movement too small for the eye to see. Dr. Rowe sent the data to a physicist friend at King's College. A week later, he visited in person, standing over the table, squinting like someone peering through centuries. He didn't laugh. He just said, "You're not going to believe this, but these ratios, 9-11-14, they're the same harmonic spacing we use in crystal resonance." He explained it as simply as he could. Modern quartz clocks rely on vibrations inside tiny crystals. When energy passes through them, they oscillate in a pattern that keeps time with astonishing accuracy. And this old gear, battered and silent, matched that same ratio, centuries before quartz existed. That's when curiosity turned into quiet disbelief. Dr. Rowe wasn't the kind of person who entertained mysticism, but she wrote in her report, "The object seems designed not for motion, but for sympathy, like a bell tuned to an unheard note." That line has haunted me ever since I read it in the archives. A bell tuned to an unheard note. It's the perfect description of what this story has always been about. The gear from Jerusalem, the cathedrals of Europe, the water clocks of Cordoba, the failed machine in Prague. All of them tuned to something that no one could quite hear, but everyone seemed to sense. When the museum published its findings, the report barely reached the press. A single column in the London Science Review called it a mechanical curiosity with unusual harmonic properties. And that was it. The object was stored in a sealed drawer, labeled simply, Unknown Clockwork. Jerusalem, Prague, London link. But one of the researchers who had worked on it, an older man named Dr. Linden, kept thinking about the vibration. He'd felt it once himself, standing alone in the lab late at night. He said it was like standing beside a sleeping animal, soft, rhythmic, faintly alive. He took a photograph before the piece was archived, a single close-up of the remaining teeth under magnification. When he developed the image, he noticed something odd. The worn metal reflected the camera flash into a spiral pattern, almost too perfect, like a fingerprint left by geometry itself. He traced it onto paper, drew the lines outward, and realized the spiral wasn't random. It matched the same golden ratio used in cathedral blueprints, temple dimensions, and yes, even the Jerusalem fragment's markings. For the first time in centuries, the measure of Solomon had drawn itself again, uninvited, unstoppable. Dr. Linden sent a copy of the spiral to a research institute in Switzerland that specialized in chronometry, the science of time. 2 months later, he received a reply stamped confidential. They had seen that same pattern before, not in ruins, not in scripture, but inside the oscillation data of their newest experiment, the world's first atomic clock. The ratio was identical. It seemed that what once lived in stone and brass had now been reborn in cesium and circuitry. The same silent pulse, still breathing beneath the noise of progress. And as one era's faith turned into another's science, the rhythm continued, unbroken. The clock hadn't died in Prague. It had only changed its heartbeat. Switzerland, 1949. The war was over, but the world still ticked with the tension it left behind. Nations were rebuilding, machines were learning to think, and for the first time in history, time itself was being redefined. Not by the sun, not by the church bell, but by the atom. In a quiet laboratory near Lake Geneva, a small group of physicists worked on something that sounded impossibly poetic for science. A clock that would never drift. They were trying to capture time at its smallest pulse, the vibration of cesium atoms as they switched states. Each oscillation was unimaginably fast, steady, and identical. The hope was that these atomic rhythms could form a new universal standard, 1 second defined by the music of matter itself. What they didn't know, at least not at first, was that their data contained a familiar shape. Among the researchers was a young man named Erich Baumann, who had studied architecture before turning to physics. He noticed something strange in the first resonance graphs. The spacing of the frequency peaks wasn't perfectly linear. It followed a subtle curve, repeating in ratios of 9:11:14. He didn't think much of it until he saw a journal article about the restoration of an old clock face recovered from London's Blitz. The same numbers, the same proportions, the same rhythm. Baumann sent for the museum report, thinking it would be a curiosity, a coincidence to amuse colleagues. But when the data arrived, he fell silent. The harmonic structure of Kelzner's ancient design, ratios carved into brass by hand, matched the quantum vibrations of cesium. Across 5 centuries, Two completely different languages had described the same pattern. That discovery never made it into the final papers. The team lead dismissed it as resonant coincidence. But Baumann kept his notes. In them, written in a careful hand, are these words: "If an ancient clock and an atomic clock share the same breath, then perhaps faith and physics are only different accents of one voice." It's the kind of sentence you can only write late at night, surrounded by quiet machines and a window full of stars. Baumann began to think of time less as a line and more as an echo. He said that each age hears time through its own instrument: the temple, the cathedral, the astrolabe, the atom, but the melody never changes. It's a comforting thought, isn't it? That the same rhythm guiding priests at dawn and builders at dusk still hums today inside the devices on our wrists. In one archived letter to a colleague, Baumann drew a comparison that reads almost like poetry. The cesium clock listens to what Solomon's temple once sang. He was careful not to say this publicly. Post-war science had no patience for mysticism, but the more he studied, the more he saw the same geometry appearing in unlikely places. The crystal chambers inside the atomic clock were cut at precise angles, angles that mirrored the triangles carved into Gothic cathedrals. Even the oscillation chambers were arranged around a central cavity like a tiny mechanical sanctum. It was accidental, of course. Yet the effect was undeniable. Once again, human hands had rebuilt a temple, this time from glass and wire. Baumann eventually published a technical paper, blandly titled "On Harmonic Stability in Cesium Oscillation Systems." It never mentioned faith or geometry, but in the margin of his draft, one line remains in pencil. "Resonance is the universe agreeing with itself." That's the phrase that connects this chapter to everything that came before. Because whether it was a stonemason in Jerusalem, an engineer in Prague, or a physicist in Geneva, they were all chasing the same thing, a pattern that felt both human and eternal. And when you think about it, that's what we've always done. We measure the heavens, we carve the earth, we tune the atom, all to find a steady note in the noise. For Kelzner, that note was divine. For Baumann, it was physical. For us, it might simply be proof that wonder is the oldest form of accuracy. But this story isn't done with him yet. Because as Baumann's experiments continued, something began to happen in the lab. Something that brought silence back into the equation. At certain times, the readings would falter. The oscillations would slow, pause, then return to perfect rhythm. Always, inexplicably, in the moments when the lab fell completely still. No footsteps, no chatter, no movement, just silence. The quieter the lab got, the steadier the numbers became. Not by much, just a thin smoothing of the line, a small kindness in the graph. But enough that the team started scheduling measurements for the late hours, when footsteps in the hallway thinned and the building remembered how to rest. They joked that the clock liked bedtime as much as people do. It wasn't proof of anything mystical. It was just one more reminder that precision thrives on patience. Baumann began keeping a notebook separate from the official logs. Not to hide results, but to keep room for things that didn't fit into tidy tables. He wrote about the way the air felt in the minutes before a good run, how the room seemed to pause, the way a chapel does right before the first note of a hymn. He wrote about resonance in plain words, two rhythms learning to agree. He drew a pendulum and a heart beside each other and labeled both keepers. On one page, in a careful hand that looks almost embarrassed to exist, he wrote, "The temple was a clock. We are inside its pendulum." It sounds poetic, but he meant it practically. If a temple sets the tempo of a community, bells, prayers, shared pauses, then people move in that rhythm whether they notice or not. The best clocks do the same. They disappear into the background and shape your day without demanding attention. Ownership barely enters into it. What matters is keeping. The old Latin file note that once floated through the Templars' circles, Custodia Lucis, the custody of light, felt like it had a twin now. Custodia Temporis, the custody of time. Custody is not control, it's stewardship. You don't dominate a rhythm. You carry it carefully, so it doesn't get dropped in the rush. In team meetings, the word drift came up often. All clocks drift a little. Temperature shifts, vibrations, tiny imperfections in the materials. The engineers countered drift with calibration. That was their craft. Nudge, tune, shelter the instrument until its natural tendency to wander was balanced by the lab's tendency to care. There's a humble beauty in that. It's the same work a sacristan does with candles, or a bell ringer with ropes. The tools change, the posture doesn't. When the lab's funding body asked for a public demonstration, Baumann pushed back, not out of secrecy, but caution. Spectacle invites hurry, and hurry was the one condition their machine disliked. He wrote a quiet memo that could have been pinned on the door of any old monastery. Accuracy improves with reverence. He defined reverence in lab terms: clean power, quiet floors, stable temperature. But everyone knew what he meant. Don't show off. Keep the rhythm safe. On a winter evening when snow pressed its soft hush against the windows, the team ran a long stability series. The cesium line rested like a held breath. For fun, engineer fun, the best kind, someone set a metronome app on a phone across the room. It ticked at a slow, human tempo. The graph didn't change, of course. The atom keeps its own counsel. But the people did. Shoulders dropped. Breathing matched. The room found a simple, shared pace. And in that pace, it became obvious what the last months had been teaching. The instrument was never alone. Human attention was always part of the loop, even when hands stayed at their sides. You can call that psychology if you like. The physicists did. They were careful not to smuggle grand claims into quiet data. But everyone kept arriving at the same sentence from different directions. We don't own time. We keep it together. Baumann's side notes started cross-referencing cathedrals. If the lab stabilized when the room behaved like a chapel, soft voices, slow movements. What happened in buildings built explicitly to cradle rhythm? He collected papers on architectural acoustics, those studies that turn naves into equations. How long a note lingers, where a whisper carries, which arches make a voice bloom instead of blur. The numbers looked familiar. Decay times, standing waves, favored frequencies, little numerical ways a space says, "This is my tempo." He visited an old church near the lake on his lunch breaks. No congregation at noon, just cold stone and a strip of light across the floorboards. He stood under the center of the dome and hummed one note, very softly. The air caught it and held it a moment longer than he expected, as if returning a borrowed coin with a thank you. In his pocket notebook he wrote, "Architecture as instrument. Under that, some instruments are tuned to people. Some are tuned to atoms. Perhaps the best are tuned to both." The lab's official report read the way reports must. Paragraphs of methods, graphs that never mentioned the hour the building was quietest, a conclusion that nodded to incremental progress. But the last internal email from Baumann to his small team felt like a benediction disguised as a checklist. Keep the floors calm. Keep the power clean. Keep the schedule humane. Remember that stability is a social achievement. There was a light joke at the end. If anyone finds a way to install stained glass in the control room, please submit a requisition. And then the line he'd carry for the rest of his life. We are custodians, not owners. That thought threads backward easily. Custodianship is why Masons drew ratios they didn't fully claim as theirs. It's why Kelzner built a device that refused to perform in a noisy room. It's why a brass dial kept one shy tick alive under London ash. The work is the same in every century. Keep a good pattern available so others can find their pace inside it. If you want a simple image for it, think of a bell. Not the dramatic strike at the hour, but the lingering ring afterward, the part that makes neighbors pause before they resume their errands. Science has its lingering ring too. A good standard echoes into other labs, into other instruments, until a whole community moves a little more in step. That's what the earliest atomic clocks became. Quiet bells that taught the world to count the same way. And once you start listening for that echo, you hear it in places that don't have circuit boards. A footbridge that hums at a certain wind, a library whose silence has a pitch, a tower whose stones prefer one note over another. Buildings keep time, not with hands and faces, but with the way they favor certain breaths, which is where our path turns next, not away from the lab, but through it, back into the world of arches and aisles. If a cesium chamber finds stability at a particular rhythm, what does a cathedral settle to when the choir stops and the dust hangs in a sunbeam? Do walls have favorite notes? Do floors remember footsteps? Does the human body, heart, lungs, brain, feel more at home when a space hums in sympathy with it? Those aren't questions for romance. They're questions for measurement. And it turns out, people have been measuring them quietly for a long time. Tap a column, read the frequency, sing a tone, time the decay, map a nave's geometry, watch the numbers rhyme with breath. Temples and atoms, cathedrals and clocks, different housings for the same old agreement. Patience in stone, patience in glass, patience in cesium. What changes is only the instrument. The rhythm keeps choosing whatever hands are ready to hold it gently. So we step out of the laboratory's hush and into the long corridors of built air to ask the walls what they remember. If you stand very still, you can hear the answer begin. Not loud, not showy, just a note that refuses to rush and a space that refuses to forget. And with that note in our ear, we walk toward the places where architecture doesn't just shelter us, it tunes us. If a lab can be tuned, a building can too. You felt it before without needing a microphone. Walk into a big stone church, clap once, and the sound doesn't just stop. It blooms, floats, and settles like a feather taking its time. That lingering tail is the room's way of saying, "This is my note." In simple terms, every space has a favorite pitch where sound feels at home. Physicists call that resonance, two rhythms agreeing to exist together. In a cathedral, those rhythms are light, stone, and breath. Early morning tests in old churches make this obvious. Acousticians bring a small speaker, sweep slowly through tones the way a painter lays down a wash of color, and watch for the spots where the walls answer. On the screen, certain frequencies rise a little taller. In the room, those same pitches feel fuller, warmer, easier to sing. It's not magic, it's craft. Long walls, high vaults, and repeating arches nudge sound into patterns the air can remember. Think of a nave, that long central aisle, as a slow stone flute. Its length favors lower notes, the height adds a soft halo around them, and side aisles add gentle echoes, like companions walking just behind you. Stand beneath the crossing, where nave and transept meet. Hum one steady tone, and the ceiling hands it back with interest. The building isn't just shelter. It's an instrument built to play time. Choirs figured this out centuries before anyone wrote equations. Many chant traditions sit a touch lower than modern concert pitch. Why? Lower notes travel farther in big spaces and feel less nervous. Some choirs even like to hover around 432 cycles per second for the note A, not because of a conspiracy, but because certain rooms seem to relax there. At that pitch, long stone aisles carry the sound like a river carries light at sunset, smooth, unhurried, and kind to the ear. You don't need to swear by the number to notice the effect. A slightly gentler tuning helps vast rooms breathe. There's a simple home test if you ever visit one of these places. Stand near a column, sing a comfortable note. Not loud, just steady, and move a step or two. At one spot, the tone will feel suddenly easier, as if the wall has begun to sing with you. You've found a pocket of resonance, the architectural equivalent of a perfect chair. It fits. Builders didn't stumble into this by luck. The Guild of the Compass learned by listening, then carved what the ear kept asking for. What the ear asks for, the eye usually confirms. Watch light in a cathedral at the top of the morning. Stained glass doesn't just color the day, it ticks it, casting bands that slide across stone in equal, predictable steps. When you stand where a colored patch lands, you feel a hush, the way you feel just before a piece of music starts. Time is being measured without a face or hands, through distance, color, and patience. Engineers today can map these favorite notes with tidy graphs, peaks and valleys like the heartbeat of a building. Tap a pier, a big interior pillar, and that pulse appears. The peaks line up with the geometry. Span length, vault height, spacing between arches. Change the shape, lower a ceiling, narrow a bay, and the pulse shifts. The building is telling you, in numbers, how it likes to be heard. Here's where our story folds back to the lab. In the cesium chamber, the team learned that stability improves when the room calms. Fewer footsteps, softer voices, steadier temperature. Cathedrals built that lesson into stone long ago. High-mass walls filter street noise. Heavy doors slow entry and exit. Even the floor plan asks you to walk in curves instead of straight lines. Everything encourages a human tempo that helps sound and attention settle. The architecture is doing what the lab did, protecting a rhythm so it can be kept. That word "kept" matters. Old builders would have called this custody, not ownership of a mystery, but caretaking. The walls don't own the chant any more than a violin owns the melody. They simply hold conditions where the song can live. You see it in small choices, rounded corners instead of sharp ones, which soften echoes, ribbed vaults that break harsh flutter into pleasant shimmer, wooden pews that drink just enough sound to keep words clear. Thousands of practical decisions, all pointing to one quiet goal: make attention easier. There's a humbler layer to this. People inside the space begin to synchronize, not just with each other, but with the room. Breathing evens out. Footsteps fall into similar lengths between stone joints. You don't think, "I will match this building." Your body simply does, the way it matches a friend's pace on a walk without planning to. That's resonance at the human scale. Comfort disguised as agreement. Numbers help us talk about what we feel. A big Gothic nave often holds sound for several seconds before it fades. Engineers call that reverberation time. Too long, and speech blurs, too short, and music feels dry. Most great churches land in a sweet middle, where words remain clear and singing feels like pouring honey. Achieving that balance without software or speakers is not an accident. It is memory, passed hand to hand in workshops. Arch heights, bay lengths, window size, ratios that have behaved well before. Some researchers like to note a pleasing coincidence. When choirs tune lower and rooms are large, certain overtones stack in ways that sketch out familiar proportions. The same golden spirals you can draw over rose windows. The same root 2 rectangles hidden in floor plans. Is that physics bowing to faith, or faith learning from physics? Maybe it's just what beauty looks like when it's practical. There's a story from Chartres that I love. During a restoration, an acoustician clapped softly under the high vault and timed the fade. An old mason watching him smiled and said, "We used to do the same test, only with a mallet on timber." He didn't mean equations. He meant ears. The tools change, the listening doesn't. And keep an eye on the bell towers. They aren't only time posters, they're metronomes for a town. Bells are cut to certain profiles, so their strongest tones sit where streets and air can carry them best. When a bell speaks, roofs answer with small vibrations, windows give a polite tremble, and for a breath or two the neighborhood shares a common envelope of sound. That shared envelope is social glue, like the lab's quiet hour, but outdoors and ancient. So yes, architecture is an instrument. It plays us gently toward the tempo we forget in the rush. When it's well tuned, we leave steadier than we came. And that brings us to the body, the oldest instrument we carry. If walls have favorite notes and bells have chosen pitches, what notes feel like home to a human heart? What swing suits a human breath? The builders guessed, the singers learned, the bells insisted. Now the body gets its say. If a building can have a favorite note, a body can too. You already know yours, even if you've never named it. It's the quiet tempo that shows up when you're finally calm, the breath that lengthens without trying, the heartbeat that stops knocking on the door and just lives in the room. Stand in a church when the bells begin, and you can feel the body lean toward that rhythm. Not by command, just by comfort. The big bell takes its swing, slow, patient, a heavy arc like a chest rising, and everything nearby starts to listen. Windows tremble, pigeons lift, conversations pause. Your breathing, if you let it, falls into step with the sound. That's resonance again. Only this time the instrument is you. Bells weren't shaped for loudness alone. Medieval founders learned by failure and by ear that a bell's profile can carry feeling. A long waist gives you a slower, fuller strike note. A slightly thicker lip keeps the voice warm instead of harsh. Put that voice high in stone, and it arrives in the square with a softness that the day can accept. It's no accident that many great bells speak roughly once every heartbeat and a half. The swing, the physical period of metal turning out and back, lands near the human resting tempo. We recognize it without thinking. The bell breathes like we do when we're not in a hurry. Inside, the same courtesy is at work. Chant traditions lean into long phrases that ride the breath instead of fighting it. Singers learn to unspool a line on the exhale, then take a small, quiet sip of air in the seam between notes. That sip is part of the music, just as much as sound is. Space is counted too. The old choir masters didn't preach relaxation. They built it into the measure. There's a simple reason this feels so good. The heart listens to the lungs. When you breathe out slowly, the heartbeat tends to slow with it. When you breathe in, it nudges faster. It's a friendly seesaw built into every body, a give and take called coupling in plain language. Good rooms reward that. Long reverberation asks you not to punch syllables, but to pour them. Pouring means longer breaths. Longer breaths mean calmer hearts. No sermon required. Just acoustics shepherding the nervous system toward the gate. Watch the rope team in a bell tower, and you'll see the same lesson in rope and muscle. 4 ringers on a peal settle into a pattern that looks like conversation. Pull, give, wait, listen. If one rushes, the sound smears. If one drags, the pattern limps. When everyone listens, the tower becomes a metronome for the town. Bakers look up from their dough at the 7th stroke without counting. Children learn, without trying, that time can be kind when it swings, not snaps. There's a kindness in the typical speeds we meet everywhere older hands were in charge. Cloister walk sized so that 10 steps match 1 slow breath. Stair risers cut a touch lower than modern code so knees don't complain during vigils. Even candle lengths chosen so a vigil psalm ends as the flame kisses the sconce. The body was the blueprint. Furniture and stone took their cues from bone and lung. Numbers can help us see the shape of that kindness. A calm human breath often sits around 5 or 6 cycles a minute. In, out, like oars. Hearts at rest beat near 1 per second, sometimes slower when the breath grows long. A heavy bells period, from pull to pull, often rides near 2 seconds. Walk a nave cut to long human proportions, and your stride will drift toward that beat without a conductor. It's not mystical, it's comfortable. Comfort is what happens when design stops arguing with biology. This is why some rooms fatigue us, and others restore us. Spaces cut for rush, low ceilings, hard glare, tight corners, force short breaths and quick steps. Spaces cut for keeping, tall air, patient light, gentle curves, invite the longer loop the body prefers. The old builders didn't have words like biophilic or cardiorespiratory coupling. They had a rule of thumb. If prayer takes an hour, build an hour into the wall. The wall will give it back. Bells make this visible in sound. Each bell doesn't sing one note. It blooms a chord. Strike, hum, minor third, fifth, stacked in ratios that please the ear because they're simple relationships. 2 to 1, 3 to 2. Neighbors that share a fence without fighting over it. Those same relationships hide in arches and windows. You can draw them on a plan and then hear them in the tower. 1 language, 2 senses. Every so often you meet a tower that seems to understand people particularly well. The ring is strong but never scolding. The afterglow hangs just long enough to settle the square before the next swing arrives. Those places were tuned with bodies in mind. The master founder chose a profile that would speak like a large animal breathing, present, steady, reassuring. The mason set the belfry openings so the voice would roll along roofs instead of slapping off facades. Someone cared enough to ask what tempo a tired town could live with. That care is a kind of ethics. A city can set its pulse with punishments, the factory horn, the deadline chime, or with companionship. Bells and aisles chose companionship. They did not command. They offered a pace and waited for people to discover that they felt better there. You could ignore it, of course, but you ignored it the way you ignore shade on a hot day, briefly and with second thoughts. All of this loops back to the small gear that started our walk. Its 24 teeth weren't an argument for precision alone. They were a reminder to divide the day in ways a person could carry. Not just units on a dial, but breaths in a life. The measure survives wherever design helps bodies remember their better rhythm, which is why the next turn in our story moves from stone and bronze into flesh and habit. If buildings and bells can nudge us toward steadier hours, What happens when a whole community sets its day to that gentler swing? What do the old prayer schedules do to sleep, to mood, to work? Monks kept a timetable for souls. Doctors now measure one for cells. The same curve appears in both diary and lab. A body happiest when time is kept with it, not against it. So we step out of the tower, let the last note thin into evening, and follow the rhythm home, to kitchens, workshops, and cloisters where people still keep time by hand. The gears are quieter there, but they turn all the same. If stone can keep a rhythm, people can too. Monks proved it the long, quiet way, by living inside a timetable until the timetable began to live inside them. The old schedule is simple once you hear it out loud. Picture a day braided by pauses, not chopped by alarms. In the deep night, matins, the long vigil. At first light, lauds, praise with the birds. Then, as the sun climbs, the hours arrive like gentle checkpoints. Prime at early morning in older houses. Terce mid-morning, sext at noon, none mid-afternoon. Evening brings vespers, soft and amber. Before bed, compline, the good-night prayer. You don't have to memorize the names. It's the spacing that matters. About every 3 hours, life is invited to breathe. In plain terms, that schedule does for a community what a pendulum does for a clock. It keeps drift from becoming chaos. Work happens, yes, but work finds its edges. No task gets to pretend it is everything. Every few hours, the bell lifts you out of your own head and reminds you that the day is bigger than your list. What's lovely is how bodies quietly agree with this. Modern medicine has its tidy phrase, circadian rhythm, meaning the 24-hour pattern your brain loves to follow when light and meals behave. Tucked inside that big circle, there are smaller ones, shorter waves of alertness and ebb, pulses in hormones that rise and fall like the tide. You don't need a lab to prove it. You already know that mid-morning often feels different from right after lunch, and late afternoon has its own weather. Researchers chart those rises and dips. Monks simply rang a bell where the body was already turning. Take terce, sext, none, roughly mid-morning, noon, and mid-afternoon. They land right where many of us naturally want a small reset, a stretch, water, a quiet minute away from the grind. Think of them as built-in recalibration points. In modern language, your stress chemistry, that helpful but bossy hormone we call cortisol, likes to peak and relax over the day rather than blaze in one long line. Short, regular pauses keep that curve friendly. The cloister discovered that centuries before graphs existed. When you live this way, the day stops being a race and becomes a loop. Wake, work, pause. Work, pause, light the lamps. The loops themselves are the work. A bell is not an interruption. It's a hand on your shoulder saying, remember to breathe. You can feel how a town might grow kinder under such timing. Bakers, carpenters, and school children all sharing the same gentle pivot points. The city learns a shared exhale. I've watched it happen in small ways outside monasteries too. A market street where a church bell still rings at noon will go quiet for a moment, even among people who don't care about church. Utensils rest, cash drawers pause. A sentence waits for its next half. It's not obedience, it's consent. The body hears a rhythm that fits, and for a heartbeat or two, it steps there. You might be thinking, lovely idea, but I've got deadlines, not candles. Fair. But notice how much of your day already tries to imitate this, even clumsily. Morning coffee is lauds in a mug. The lunch walk is sexed by another name. That late afternoon glass of water and 5-minute stare out the window? None, improvisational addition. The old schedule wasn't designed to make life quaint. It was designed to help minds not fray. Monastic houses did this with craft, not theory. They cut stairs a touch shallower so tired legs could keep the rhythm without complaint. They set tables so that meals landed at the same window of light each season. They tuned bells so the tone would travel just enough to reach workshops, but not scold babies. Timekeeping was a hospitality, not a leash. There's friendly science under the poetry. When people pause together and breathe a little slower, hearts tend to follow. The nervous system, always scanning for "are we safe?" takes its cue from the room. Lower shoulders, longer exhales, eyes softening. That signals "we're okay" better than a meeting memo ever could. Repeat that signal a few times a day, and you don't just feel calmer, you get sturdier. The immune system likes good timing. Sleep thanks you later. Even attention, that skittish animal, learns to trust it will be called back kindly and stops bolting. The best part is how ordinary it is. No incense required. You can borrow the skeleton of the hours without changing your clothes. Try it as an experiment. 3 small breaks, roughly 3 hours apart. Don't doom scroll. Step, stretch, sip, stand in the square inch of sun in your kitchen, and let your eyes land far away for 30 seconds. That's all. You're not becoming medieval. You're becoming rhythmic. Monks would smile at the idea of productivity hacks. They didn't chase efficiency. They guarded attention the way locksmiths guard keys. That's what the schedule is. A fence that keeps the wolves of hurry from getting inside too often. When you return to a task after a brief, honest pause, the work is the same size, but your hands are steadier. You remember you're a person, not a motor. Shared schedules also soften edges between people. If a bell asks everyone to stop at once, the baker doesn't feel weak for resting, and the scribe doesn't feel heroic for refusing. The pause belongs to the town. No one has to earn it. That communal mercy may be the most sacred thing the hours ever kept. All of this circles back to the measure we've been following. Not a rule book, but a rhythm. The temple kept it in stone, the cathedrals in light, the clocks in glass. Monks kept it in breath, and when they wrote their day, they left a small puzzle in the margins, whispered more than written, about a sliver of time that didn't appear on official lists, a space where no bell rang and no ledger marked the minutes. They treated it like a held note between phrases, a quiet seam where attention could reset without anyone noticing. People later called it a rumor. Some called it superstition. The old choirman had a simpler name for it, spoken softly so it wouldn't grow proud. They called it the hour that isn't there, and they swore that if you learned to find it, the rest of the day learned to forgive you. Monks used to whisper about an hour that wasn't on the schedule. Not a secret meeting, not a hidden ritual, just a space they treated with gentleness. It lived in the seam between matins, the long night prayer, and lauds, the praise at first light. After the vigil ended and before dawn sang, there was a hush that didn't have a name. No bell rang, no page turned. It was as if the day paused to wet its lips before speaking. If you've ever been awake then, you know the feel of it. Windows still hold the night, but the dark is thinning. The air has that clean, washed smell, cold stone, damp earth, a faint trace of bread from somewhere brave enough to light an oven early. Birds are deciding whether to start. The world isn't asleep or awake, it's balanced. Monks learned to leave that balance alone. They didn't call it mystical. They called it practical. After hours of psalms, voices need rest. After long wakefulness, minds need a quiet that doesn't ask for anything. So they let the world breathe without them for a little while, and found over time that the day came back kinder when they did. Later generations nicknamed it the 13th hour. Not because they added time, but because they refused to spend a sliver of it, a small Sabbath inside the ordinary week of minutes. There's a mechanical picture that helps. In old clocks, between one tick and the next, there's a tiny balance, an instant when the escapement, the part that doles out motion, isn't pushing or being pushed. It's resting on the tooth, poised, ready, not yet committed. That pause is what makes the next tick clean. The monks found the same pause in life. When you protect that little moment of neither, the next swing lands true. You can dress this up in modern language if you like. People talk about the observer effect in physics, the simple idea that measuring something can change it, even if only a little. Attention has weight. In human terms, watching your own day too closely can make it jitter. The 13th hour was the counter move, a tiny window with no measurement, no counting, no naming. A quantum Sabbath, if you enjoy metaphors, where you stop checking the clock so the clock can remember how to be kind. Biology nods along. Just before dawn, a lot of body systems reset. Temperature creeps to its low, certain hormones swap shifts, sleep lightens so waking won't feel like a shove. It's a built-in handover, delicate and busy. Interrupt it with noise and panic, and you'll spend the morning paying the tax. Leave it alone, and the day stands up straighter. The old houses learned by feel. They placed lauds not at the first gray, but a touch after, when the hush had done its work. They kept the corridors dim. They cut footfalls to a soft rule. Heel never louder than breath. If the kitchen had to move, it moved in whispers. In some places, they even set the lamps so that light rose in steps, like a gentle dawn inside the walls. No spectacle, just hospitality for time itself. You can borrow this without changing your life. A minute will do. Close the loop of one task, close it cleanly, then sit in that neither before you start the next. No phone, no plan. Let your eyes rest on the farthest thing in the room. If you try to improve it, you'll wreck it. That's the point. Nothing improved. Everything steadied. Communities feel the benefit too. A kitchen that refuses to rush the first loaf makes a better second one. A workshop that lets the first 10 minutes belong to light and hands, not orders, tends to produce fewer mistakes before lunch. A town square that holds a heartbeat of silence after the bell finishes ringing teaches gentleness to strangers without any speeches. These are small courtesies that add up to a day that doesn't bruise. There's humor here if you want it. We're very good at inventing apps to remind us to breathe. The monks did the cheaper version. Breathe, then don't brag about it. They understood that some things get lighter when you stop lifting them. The rumor of a missing hour traveled farther than cloister walls. Copyists like to leave hints, tiny gaps in a line of script, an uninked bead between two illuminated capitals, a space too deliberate to be accident. Architects borrowed the trick with light, a blank pane above a window that admits only soft sky, a patch of wall that is intentionally bare so the eye has a field to rest in. Even bells participate. If you've ever noticed two strokes spaced a breath longer than the rest near dawn, you've met a bell ringer who honors the seam. All roads in our story keep pointing back to the measure, not as math alone, but as manners. The temple divided days by offerings. The cathedrals divided air by intervals. The clocks divided swings by mercy. The monks divided attention by care. The 13th hour is their shared good habit. Leave a little unfenced time at the edge of things. That habit, kept over centuries, leaves fingerprints. In a few old notebooks, nothing fancy, just carpenters' and vergers' jottings, you find doodles that aren't quite plans, interlocking circles with no numbers, spirals with no hands, ratios arranged like a lace of pauses rather than a schedule of strokes. They're not telling minutes, they're tuning them. Instruments without faces, designed to keep a room, a choir, a town in gentle agreement with itself. One margin note in a hand so small you can miss it says simply, "Keep the gap." Another, in Latin, "Vacuum bene custoditum," the well-kept empty. A pretty phrase for something very practical. Protect the little spaces, and the big patterns behave. Pieces like these travel the way all good patterns do, quietly. A church warden copies a sketch into a ledger. A mason borrows the curve into a stairwell. A bell founder uses the spacing to shape a partial that feels like dawn. None of it shouts. All of it serves. The result, over time, is a family of designs that do the same job without looking the same. They hold rhythm without gripping it. Follow that family long enough, and you arrive at a curious branch. A set of drawings from the 1600s and 1700s with no numerals, no tick marks, no ornament. Just rings and ratios woven together like the inside of a seashell. They're labeled with words like temporare, to keep in tune, and ordinare, to set in order. Never horologium, clock. An instrument then, but not for telling. For helping everything nearby fall back into step. People who saw those pages later didn't always know what to call them. Some filed them with music, some with architecture, some with astronomical devices. If you look with the eyes we've been using, temples, bells, breath, you see something simpler. A keeper that refuses a face, because faces invite hurry. And this is where the trail bends toward a desk in a quiet library, where a thin folio waits among forgotten parish accounts. A folio that holds the cleanest of those drawings, the one that makers kept copying when they needed to fix a room's mood rather than its minutes. No hands, no hours, only relations. A clock that doesn't count, only tunes. You could mistake it for decoration. But if you place it near a life that's been rushing, or a building that's been shouting, or a team that's been grinding its teeth, something begins to soften, exactly the way the seam between matins and lauds softens the day. Call it the 13th hour in ink, a pattern drawn to keep the gap, a reminder that the cleanest ticks happen right after the world remembers not to make one. Libraries have their own weather. Some are bright and busy, but the good ones, the really old ones, carry a cool, steady climate made of paper, polish, and patience. The kind where a cough feels loud and a turning page sounds like a small sail catching wind. In one of those rooms, a long oak table held a thin folio that almost no one requested. Its catalog line was unpromising. Mechanica Miscellanea, c. 1670, 1010. Anonymous. No title to boast with, no famous owner. But when the conservator untied the faded tape and opened the first leaf, the sketches inside started doing the quiet thing certain drawings do. They lowered the room a few degrees and made the air stand still. No numerals, no clock face. Just rings and lines woven into each other like ripples from different stones meeting on a pond. Some rings touched, some crossed, some nested as if the paper had learned to breathe in curves. In the margin, small words in a tidy hand. Temporare, concordare, ratio lucis, intervallum taciturnum, to keep in tune, to agree. The ratio of light, the interval of silence. Whoever drew this wasn't trying to count minutes. They were trying to tune a place. A note on the inside cover gave the folio's dullest fact. and its softest promise. Acquired with parish papers, Trinity, 1896. Rediscovered in audit, 1998. Rediscovered is a generous word for someone finally looked. The someone was a junior archivist with an affection for unloved boxes and a talent for spotting patterns where labels gave up. She laid a transparency grid over one diagram out of habit and noticed something satisfying. The crossings landed in simple relationships: 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 5. Neighbors in a family of numbers that feels like nature's handwriting. You don't need the term Fibonacci to know this family. It's the one more than before series that appears in pine cones and sunflowers, in the way shells spiral tighter, in the way a crowd spreads when the path opens. Start with 1, add the last number to get the next, and keep going. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8. What matters isn't the list. It's the way the ratios between neighbors settle toward a comfortable proportion. A growth that never feels like a lurch. The folio's rings lived in those proportions. They weren't strict like a grid, more like a net that gave without tearing. On another page, the rings lined up with a ladder of small marks, not notes, not hours, phrases. The archivist, who sang in a small choir on Thursdays, recognized the lengths: short, short, long, long, short, long, rest. It looked suspiciously like chant laid sideways. An annotation in Latin murmured, Salmorum mensura, non numerus. The measure of the Psalms, not their number. That is, don't count the verses, feel their span. If that sounds fanciful, think of how a good reader takes a line. Not syllable, 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 but shape, breath, sense. The anonymous hand seemed to say a room should be read the same way. Build its lengths so words have room to land. Set its windows so the day has a steady beat. Leave a pocket of quiet between the big moves so people don't fray. A later sheet offered a little legend, useful as a key. A small circle labeled lux for light at a certain angle. A hash for umbra shadow. A dotted arc for vox, the path of a voice. And, my favorite, a thin blank band labeled silentium. The silence wasn't a mistake. It was a part of the instrument. The 13th hour we met in practice had a place in ink. There were practical touches, too. One diagram paired a ring pattern with a plan for an entryway. Doors offset so arrivals turn instead of charge. Floors laid in long stones that suggest slower steps. A bench tucked where a sun patch will always visit around mid-morning. A simple note beside it. Mores formantur habitu spati. Our manners are formed by the habit of a space. In plain speech, the room teaches you how to behave. On the back of that sheet, a thin spiral opened from a center point and stepped outward in measured arcs. Each step the same ratio larger than the last. Along the spiral, the scribe had pricked tiny marks where a bell's partial tones might sit. And at 3 of those points he'd drawn a minuscule hand, like the clock we keep refusing to build. Beside each, cantus responsorium requise. Song, answer, rest. Not minutes, moments. You can imagine, if you like, the person who drew these. Not a grand theorist, but a caretaker. The kind of mind that thinks with its hands. Someone who knew that rooms and people can be tuned with the same courtesy. They didn't need to say Fibonacci or golden ratio or root 2. They said temporare and let the paper hum. What gives the folio teeth, beyond beauty, is how often the drawings land where human comfort lives. One pattern lays out distances that let a voice carry without strain. Another sets window heights so a winter sun will live on a certain patch of floor for exactly long enough to warm a pair of hands before sext. Another nests arches so their lingering echo, the little tale of sound engineers, later called reverberation, lands in the sweet range where words stay clear and song feels like poured syrup. Not too much, not too little. The old joke applies. Goldilocks was an acoustician. Turn further, and you meet a page that looks like a map of a night sky, but isn't. Dots in rings, lines connecting families, a few empty seats left on purpose. The caption, Intervalla bene custodita, intervals well kept. The archivist traced it with a pencil and realized the empty seats were the best part. They were the gaps that keep patterns from turning into noise. The scribe was teaching future hands to leave room. By now the dominoes fall easily. A pattern meant to tune a doorway scales to a nave. A spiral meant to seat a small choir scales to a square. A ratio meant to set a bell's voice scales to a lab where frequency is king. Different centuries, same manners. Build for breath and listening, and the rest will treat you gently. Skeptics will ask for proof beyond pretty curves, and they're not wrong to. The archivist tried something mild. She copied one pattern into vellum, laid it under tracing paper, and sketched the plan of a small village hall that had always felt sharp during public meetings. Voices brittle, tempers fast. Then she moved the doors to match the suggested turns, widened a bay to the nearest friendly ratio, and penciled a blank panel where a clutter of notices had shouted. The plan felt calmer before a single stone moved. A local architect later borrowed the idea during renovations. When the hall reopened, the town didn't become saintly. But people lingered longer in the doorway before speaking, and somehow that was enough. Toward the back, a page wore a stain shaped like a teardrop of wax. The drawing beneath it was the cleanest of the lot. 3 nested rings, a handful of marks, one slim corridor cutting diagonally like a river in a field. A line in Latin curved along the middle ring. Non numerari tempus, sed componere. Do not count time. Compose it. That's the heart of the thing, and it lands without fuss. You don't beat the day into equal pieces. You arrange it so the pieces agree. As for where the folio came from, the paper tells on itself. Scraps recycled, watermarks that belong to parishes, not princes, margins repaired by a careful, poor hand. The ink leans brown where iron bled with age. A keeper's book, passed along the way church keys are, always local, always important. It's tempting to wrap ribbon around mysteries like this, but the plainest reading is the best. Somebody built an instrument you could lay under other plans to see where they fought their own purpose. Not a clock you'd wind, but a score you'd play a room against until it stopped shouting. And that bends us toward the experiment no one could resist trying once the pages were scanned and shared. What happens if you take these ratios off paper and let them live again? In stone, in schedules, even in circuits. Do streets walk softer? Do meetings fray less? Does a laboratory's line hold steadier when the room is arranged for breath instead of brag? The folio doesn't answer. It only offers manners. The answers arrive when someone is brave enough to build with them. Some tools don't announce themselves with dials and hands. They work the way a good host works, quietly rearranging the room so everyone feels steadier without knowing why. The folio of rings and pauses felt like that kind of tool. Not a clock to tell time, but a score to tune it. Engineers have a tidy phrase for why this might matter. Drift. All clocks wander a little. Heat swells apart, cold shrinks it, a floor hums, a wire buzzes, and the second you thought you had slips a hair to the left. Big deal? Usually not. But stack enough small wobbles and instruments stop agreeing. Tuning, in plain language, means trimming those wobbles so the whole room keeps better company with itself. Someone had to try the folio for real. A small team did it the safe way. No cathedrals, no grand speeches, just a room. 4 white walls, a lab bench, a shelf of careful equipment, and a temperamental measurement that hated footsteps. They didn't change the machine. They changed the habits of the space to match the drawings. Doors offset so you turn and slow before entering. A clear band of nothing on the wall where the eye could rest. A bench set exactly where mid-morning light would land and soothe the fidgets. The floor got a soft path, long boards laid in the direction people naturally walk, so steps stretched instead of chopped. On paper, it looked like feng shui met carpentry. In practice, it felt like a room exhaling. They ran the same measurement as before. The line didn't turn miraculous, it turned reliable. Variance shrank, little hiccups smoothed. If you wanted a headline, there wasn't one. If you wanted a life, this was the kind of change that adds years to patience. A village hall tried a gentler version. Meetings had been sharp there, voices brittle, tempers quick. The builder borrowed 3 moves from the folio, broke the straight shot from door to dais with a quiet bend, raised the windows so winter light pooled on the floor like a rug, and left a deliberate blank panel at the front for the eyes to rest on between sentences. Nobody posted a plaque. People just started pausing half a heartbeat before answering. It turns out time doesn't only live on clocks, it lives in the gap between a question and its reply. The test that convinced the skeptics came from a place that doesn't care about poetry. A frequency lab. They replicated the folio's ratios as acoustic mass, simple baffles sized to the ring intervals, added a silent band, literally a clear stretch of wall with nothing on it, and set the daily schedule to 3 small pauses, evenly spaced. The instruments didn't notice the charm. They noticed the noise floor drop a fraction and stability hold longer on tricky runs. The write-up was dry, as it should be, but it carried the same old lesson in lab clothes. Arrange a space for breath and attention, and accuracy behaves. If the folio had a motto, it was scribbled in that curved line near the back. Do not count time, compose it. You see it each time a design choice takes the side of rhythm over rush. Doors that suggest a turn instead of a charge. Stairs that ask for patience. Benches where the sun visits at the same hour. Even lighting can play along. Lamps that rise in stages like a friendly dawn instead of snapping on like an alarm. None of this changes the position of the sun. It changes how we keep it. There's a word from instruments that fits here. Feedback. Not the squeal of a microphone, but the quiet friendship between a player and a violin. The way the instrument gives back what the hands put in, teaching the next stroke. Rooms can do that. Schedules can too. Keep 3 daily pauses for a week, and the 4th day's work meets you halfway. Not because you've become saintly, but because your nervous system has learned the beat and stops fighting it. The folio's circles are feedback made visible. The bolder minds wondered, could these ratios travel into circuits? Not mystical patterns in chips, just humane rhythms in how a system asks for attention. One team tried a software build pipeline that followed the folio's pacing. 90-minute work windows, 9-minute thin silence, a 3-minute gap with no alerts allowed. The error rate didn't vanish. It stopped spiking at 4 in the afternoon. When they moved the thin silence to match local light, the window when the sun hit the wall the way the folio predicted. Late commits lost their frantic edge. Call it placebo if you like. Or call it what the monks called it, a kept interval. Even streets can use this. A planner laid the spiral onto a small plaza. edging cafe tables into the wider arcs, leaving the inner ring open as the folio suggested. No planters, no signs, just sky and breathing room. Foot traffic stopped jamming at the corner. Conversations drifted a shade softer. Nothing happened. Everything got easier. At this point, the pattern had threaded places that don't talk. Labs, halls, squares, and places that do. Lungs, throats, bells. The sensible next step was to ask a machine to draw what all these trials were circling. Not a face with numbers, a model of agreement. So a quiet group did what makers do when they don't trust slogans. They built a digital twin of the folio's cleanest page and let a solver push simulated air and light across it. Then they fed in two more ghosts, the radius of that bronze fragment from Jerusalem and the dial sketch from Prague, the one with the shy words for light and silence. This is where the domino we've been following made a sound you could almost hear. The curves married. The fragment's radius nested into the folio's second ring, as if it had been waiting for the invitation. The Prague dial's letters landed on nodes where the model liked to rest. Everything that had wandered across centuries, stone, brass, paper, fell into a single harmonic spiral. No hours, no hands. Just a path that corrects itself forever. A shape that never closes into a cage and never blows itself apart. A keeper, not a boss. Engineers will insist, rightly, that a pretty spiral isn't a proof. But it is a direction. It tells you which way to lean to make a room kinder, a schedule friendlier, a measurement steadier. It tells you that the design we've been chasing was never built to win an argument about seconds. It was built to help everything nearby remember its better pace. And if you lay that spiral beside the older rumors, the gear with 24 divisions, the dial that asked for silence, the builders who left a blank band where the eye could rest, you begin to see the outline of a thing that wanted to exist, couldn't, and learned to live by fragments instead. Fragments don't stay fragments forever. Sometimes they find each other. Sometimes a model snaps into focus, and you realize the missing piece you've been hunting wasn't a piece at all. It was a ratio, the last relation that lets all the others behave. The folio closes without telling you where to find it. The room tells you instead. In the swing that settles, in the pause that cleans the next note, in the turn that slows a rush at the door. But the numbers want their moment too, and they will have it. Because when the spiral was matched to the Jerusalem fragment and the Prague circle, something simple and stubborn appeared. An interval that kept repeating in the simulation like a heartbeat at rest. Not a minute. Not a second. A return, the time it takes an agreement to come back to itself when the world nudges it off-center. Hold that thought. The last fragments are about to meet in metal and math, and a pattern that has breathed through stone, song, and cesium will show its face. Not to count us, but to keep us company. The bronze fragment from Jerusalem had never looked like much. Just a ring with tired teeth and a memory you could feel more than see. But good ideas have a way of waiting for the right table. This one finally found its table in a small studio that smelled like graphite and warm circuit boards, half library and half workbench, where paper and metal shook hands without arguing over who was older. They started with scans. The museum sent a high-resolution image of the fragment. Every nick, every shadow. A conservator in Prague shared Kelsner's dial tracing, the circle with the shy Hebrew words for light and silence still faintly visible under soot. And the archivist with the choir girl Patience uploaded the folio's cleanest spiral, the one that looked less like a clock and more like a path that never stopped correcting itself. On the screen, The three files sat like guests not sure where to put their hands. Someone set transparent layers and nudged the Jerusalem ring over the Prague circle. At first it missed by a whisper, the way lids on old jars sometimes do. Then they remembered what the conservator had written years ago. Heat has made the radius coy. Trust the inner edge. So they did. They aligned to the untouched inside, not the blistered outside, and the fit came home. The radius, Jerusalem's inner curve, landed on Kelsner's dial as if drawn there on purpose centuries apart. No wrestling, no clever cheats. The match was so simple that the room went quiet the way rooms do when a puzzle piece finally snaps in and all your fussing turns into a small, private laugh. That would have been enough for most of us. But the spiral on the third layer kept raising its hand. The folio's line, that gentle growth that never rushes, was asking to be invited too. They slid it in, set the center where Kelsner had placed the tiniest crosshair, and turned the transparency down until the rings and teeth could share the page without stepping on each other. Something patient appeared. The fragment's radius became the spiral's second ring. Kelsner's lettering fell almost perfectly onto the spiral's resting points, the little ledges where the line likes to breathe before it keeps moving. Or drifted to a node that the folio had labeled Lux in a different century. Shetika came to rest near a slender band of silentium the anonymous caretaker had protected on paper, like a gardener protecting shade. No one applauded. A few people sat back. Someone exhaled the way you do when a tight knot loosens without snapping. The room moved from screens to hands. They printed the three shapes on vellum weight film and laid them on a light box, building the old thing the way the old hands would have. One circle, then a second, then the path that negotiates between them. Up close, the teeth on the Jerusalem ring looked like worn prayers. The Prague circle felt like a question that had been waiting politely to be answered. The folio's spiral, still the most modest of the three, refused to be dramatic. It simply kept the peace. They didn't talk about proof. They talked about fit. Fit is what craftsmen say when a joint stops squeaking. Fit is what singers mean when a harmony sits down and no one needs to lean. Here, fit meant the three orphans, stone-born geometry, brass-born aspiration, paper-born manners, had found a home together that none of them could make alone. For those who like things you can touch, there was plenty. A machinist from down the hall cut a thin brass ring to the fragment's inner curve and sanded it until it kissed the dial print without pride. A designer etched the spiral into a clear disc and dropped it over the brass until the line met the ring like water meeting the rim of a bowl. Someone set a tiny LED at the center, not to be fancy, just to give the eye a steady point while the rest of the world found its balance. They didn't wind it, because there was nothing to wind. They just breathed near it, human warmth fogging the disc for a heartbeat, and watched how the shadows from the teeth walked along the spiral as the lamp above them hummed its low, electrical hum. The shadows didn't chase seconds. They drifted in a way that felt like the body returning to a posture it prefers. Shoulders down, jaw light, breath a touch longer than usual. It was nothing you could present to a committee. It was everything you feel when a chair fits. For those who like terms, someone wrote the phrase harmonic spiral on a sticky note and stuck it to the table. In human words, a path that keeps stepping outward by the same gentle more every time. The way shells grow, the way a fern unfurls, the way a city plaza feels comfortable when the circles of tables respect each other's edges. It is not a trap. It is not a race. It is a promise that small, steady corrections can carry a life without drama. That's what the spiral did here. It didn't turn the fragment into a clock. It turned it into a keeper, an object that reminds everything near it to return to a better center when nudged. A violin doesn't force your hand. It invites your hand to behave. This did the same. They took the assembly off the light box and put it near a window so the sun, not the lamp, could have its hour. Mid-morning light stepped across the rings in slow strides. Where the spiral asked for a pause, the shadow paused. Where the dial offered a rest, the shadow softened. When a cloud passed, the whole thing fell quiet and waited without complaint, then resumed as if it had been designed not to mind interruptions. Out came the small instruments. Nothing fancy, just a photodiode and a data logger the size of a deck of cards, to see if the shadows crossing could be read the way you listen to a bell's aftertone with a fingertip on the wood. They didn't expect fireworks. They were listening for return, how long a small disturbance takes to calm. They found one. A nudge, a hand moving, a draft, would throw the shadow off its easy arc. Then, without scolding, the pattern would settle back along the spiral in a time that kept showing up again, like the way a rocking chair returns to stillness at its own favorite pace no matter who sat in it last. Not a number for the wall, a number for the hand. What to call that number? The old folio had offered a phrase without asking for credit. Intervalla bene custodita, intervals well kept. The lab had a plainer word, settling time. Everyone agreed on the meaning. This little marriage of ring, circle, and line didn't count time. It corrected it. It made small errors cheap to fix. If you've ever learned to ride a bicycle, you already know the comfort of such a thing. You don't stay up by being rigid. You stay up by making tiny, constant, merciful adjustments. Left a touch, right a touch, until balance stops being a trick and becomes a habit. The spiral was a picture of that habit. The ring and the circle gave it something honest to work on. A few people in the room wanted to turn the fit into a headline. A few wanted to keep it like a secret recipe. Most landed in the sensible middle. Write it down cleanly. Give it to places that could use less rush and more return. Workshops, meeting rooms, labs, bell towers, and see whether the same small mercy appears. Fewer jolts, quicker calms, kinder lines. The bronze fragment did not glow. The dial did not sing. The spiral did not solve anyone's life. Together, they made a quiet claim that felt almost like a compliment. You don't have to be perfect. You have to be corrigible, correctable, willing to come back gently when the world bumps you. They left the assembly on the table and stepped back to let the room breathe. In the glass of a cabinet behind it, reflections layered, ring inside, circle inside, spiral, until the shapes threw a faint geometry across the far wall that looked for a moment like a star sketched by patience. No one said it aloud. No one had to. The pattern had found a voice that didn't need sound. And when the building settled for the evening, when footsteps thinned and the heater stopped arguing with itself, the little logger on the table ticked a thin line that curved the way the spiral curved, and repeated a return the way breath repeats when you finally stop hurrying. It wasn't telling a time. It was keeping a promise. Night arrived without ceremony, sliding down the windows of the small lab until the reflection of the spiral glowed against the glass like a faint coin left under water. The team didn't bother with overhead lights, only the single lamp that had watched the day with them, its circle of warmth cupping the table. The little device, a stack of 3 centuries of patience, sat in that pool of light, quiet as a thought you almost forget to finish. The brass ring caught the color of dusk. The etched spiral held its calm, and the dial with its words for light and silence seemed to breathe in time with the room. Someone leaned close and adjusted the sensor feed on the monitor. The screen pulsed gently. Just background static, nothing more. But as the last footsteps outside faded and the air in the lab cooled, the trace began to move with a rhythm no one had programmed. Not a swing, not a pulse. More like the slow intake and release of breath through a half-open door. It wasn't alive. It was responsive. They tried simple tests. Step near, step back. The graph bent and steadied, as though the brass and glass had learned to notice bodies in the room. The metal's faint temperature rise altered air density. The light scattered. The shadow lines on the spiral drifted, and the sensors caught the delay. The pattern that emerged was soft, but exact. Every movement in the room caused a wave that curved along the spiral's path and returned to center in the same measured time. 7.2 minutes. That was the interval. Over and over, regardless of who stood near or what light burned, the spiral settled itself in that span. A tiny echo of the incense offerings described in the oldest temple records, the ones spaced by the same breadth of minutes. No one claimed miracle. Engineers don't. They call things repeatable phenomena. But there was a hush, the kind that falls when math and myth lean close enough to share a chair. The same ratio that had hidden in Solomon's measurements, in cathedrals and bells and cesium clocks, was watching its own echo in the modern world. Someone whispered that phrase from the folio, intervalla bene custodita, intervals well kept. Someone else murmured that this was what happens when observation and design finally agree. The object didn't care about belief. It cared about attention. It performed its slow correction the same way a heart does when it's left in peace. The data logs showed nothing supernatural, only resonance curves, fine arcs of energy transfer calming themselves, mapping patience. Yet one observer wrote a single line in her notebook that didn't belong to physics. It behaves as if it prefers to be witnessed gently. That sentence stayed. Because the longer they watched, the more they saw that the spiral didn't react to noise or command. It answered stillness. The steadier the room, the cleaner the return. When they turned away and talked, the line thickened. When they fell quiet, it thinned into elegance. It was as if time itself had been waiting for manners. Someone joked that the device was watching back, that it measured not seconds, but serenity. They laughed, but softly, because laughter counted too. The line twitched, adjusted, forgave. They left it running overnight. Cameras watched from the corners. The building cooled, the heaters clicked. The city outside settled into its own mechanical heartbeat. At dawn, when the first tram scraped the rails, the monitors showed the pattern completing a perfect cycle. 7.2 minutes to drift out, 7.2 to come home. One full breath of the world. When the team returned, the data looked like an ink drawing of a spiral that had finally remembered its own geometry. In the center was a small loop, almost circular, where the movement damped into stillness so exact that the signal disappeared into the background. A rest written in light. They didn't touch it. They just stood there. A semicircle of tired minds realizing they had built something that didn't tick or count but listened. A quiet mirror. One of them said, almost to herself, maybe we were never measuring time. Maybe time was measuring how we behave around it. No one corrected her. By the window, morning spilled across the brass until the words on the dial, light and silence, caught the sun together for the first time. The reflection climbed the wall, traced the outline of the shelf, and lingered on a framed photograph. A cathedral nave, empty, mid-chant, shafts of dust climbing like incense. That was when it became clear. The thing on the table wasn't built to conquer seconds or prove divinity. It was a reminder that rhythm survives where reverence does, that the best clocks don't rule time, they keep it company. The researcher who closed the notebook wrote one more line before leaving. It isn't the clock that watches us. It's the pause between ticks. Outside, the city's bells began to ring, the mechanical kind, earnest and unknowing, and for a moment, their echoes seemed to fall into the same 7-minute drift the spiral had chosen. A harmony unnoticed by the hurry of cars, but not by the walls. From Jerusalem's buried ring, through Kelsner's dying dream, through monks, masons, physicists, and caretakers, the measure had arrived here. Alive not in metal, but in the way humans keep learning to return gently to the center. And that is where the next hour begins. A soft hour, the one that remains. Jerusalem again. Morning before the crowds. The light climbs slowly through the dust, soft as breath on glass. From the overlook above the Temple Mount, you can hear the city tuning itself. The layered calls, the faint toll of bells, the hum of tires starting their day. It is not a symphony, it is a pulse. The scientist stands at the edge of the rail, the same kind of railing that guards every ancient height in the world. She doesn't carry equipment today, only a small notebook folded once to mark a page. Inside, she's copied the spiral. No numbers, no names, just that gentle line that knows how to correct itself. Below her, stone terraces catch the light in the order their builders intended. Shadows retract, reveal, rest. The mosques and churches breathe together like lungs sharing a rhythm no one wrote down. From somewhere behind her, a bell tower speaks 3 notes, each one finding its echo in the distant call to prayer. She closes her eyes and lets the sounds meet halfway. There, in the middle, something ancient stirs, not revelation, not awe, just the quiet recognition of a pattern the body already keeps. The heart, the pendulum, the same negotiation of push and return. Every living thing measures its world with these gentle swings. Inhale and release, step and settle, give and wait. The city is doing it too. Buses pause before turns, doors open and close in rhythm. People fall into unplanned cadence as they cross the square. Even the pigeons rise in timed bursts, as if the air itself remembers the old ratios. When she opens her eyes, the sun has reached the brass plates on the nearby roof, the old ones that mark the prayer hours, and for a heartbeat, they glow with the same pale hue the flames in Paris once made around Jacques de Molay. Blue-white, a calm that looks like heat remembering mercy. She breathes it in. It's the same warmth that carried through cathedrals and laboratories, through masons and monks, through brass and vellum. Not sacred fire, just the discipline of attention, the art of keeping a steady hand while everything else rushes past. In the back of her mind, the data curves from the spiral project drift like quiet waves. That 7.2-minute return, that perfect patience, she can almost feel it in her own body now. The slight sway humans make when they're thinking, when they're listening, when they're remembering that balance isn't stillness. It's kindness repeated. She walks toward the narrow stairs leading down to the street. The steps are worn smooth by centuries of feet, 1,000 small pendulums swinging between intention and arrival. Somewhere below, vendors are lifting shutters. The smell of bread rides the air. Life beginning again, measured not by clocks, but by need, by breath, by hunger, by love. The notebook slips from her hand as she pauses to tie her shoe. It falls open on the steps, the spiral catching a ray of light. For a moment, the whole drawing brightens, the way an old window flares when sun hits the right angle. A passerby notices and slows down, thinking it's gold leaf, but it's only graphite warmed by morning. Still, the stranger smiles and murmurs, "Beautiful," before continuing on, and that is enough. The pattern is alive again, not as a secret, but as a courtesy between people who will never meet. Because that's what the Clock of Solomon really was, not a machine, not a relic, but a shared agreement to walk the earth in rhythm with something larger and gentler than ourselves. Somewhere in the distance, three faiths keep time in overlapping voices, a bell, a chant, a call. Each believes it is telling the hour. Together, they are proving the day can hold all three and still keep perfect balance. The human pendulum keeps swinging. Not mechanical, not divine, just human, which might be the most sacred kind of rhythm there is. When she reaches the bottom of the stairs, she looks back once more toward the Temple Mount. The air is shimmering now, every sound and shadow finding its place in the slow, forgiving measure that has always been there. In the margin of her notebook, under the spiral, she writes, "The measure keeps us when we forget to keep it." And with that, she walks into the sunlight, another quiet pendulum returning home. The lamps of Jerusalem bloom one by one, each flame a quiet heartbeat in the dusk. From the high streets you can hear both bells and the call to prayer, their sounds weaving together like breath shared between strangers. The city exhales. The scientist watches, notebook closed. She doesn't take notes anymore. There's nothing left to measure. The rhythm has already done its work. All through history, people have built ways to remember this. The monks guarding an invisible hour, the masons tuning cathedrals to the sound of patience, the scholars who believed light and silence could keep the world in balance. None of them were counting. They were listening. Maybe that's what Solomon understood from the beginning, that time doesn't need to be ruled, only kept gently. That if we stop chasing it, it will walk beside us again. She looks down at her hand, feeling her own pulse, a soft echo of the pendulum beneath every stone, every clock, every prayer. The same old secret. We are part of time's keeping. The bells ring once more, and the echo stretches through the streets like a thread of gold. For a moment, all the noise of the world pauses to breathe in sync. And maybe, wherever you are listening now, you can feel it too. The small rhythm that never left, the heartbeat under the noise, the quiet reminder that we are all, in some way, pendulums trying to return to center. So before the next tick arrives, tell me softly, where in your life do you feel time move differently? In a place, a sound, a memory? Leave your answer below. Because somewhere, in the long rhythm of the world, your story becomes part of the keeping too.